So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. Have you ever wondered what happens when isolation breeds desperation? When families become so cut off from civilization that they create their own twisted versions of faith and tradition? Deep in the fog-shrouded valleys of Appalachia, where federal law was little more than a distant rumor and survival meant making deals with forces most people wouldn't dare acknowledge, two clans discovered that some prayers get answered by things that were never meant to be worshipped. Before we descend into these forgotten hollows, where shadows moved independently of their sources, and the very air seemed to whisper secrets, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, what we're about to uncover will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between faith and madness. And if you're fascinated by the dark corners of American history, where reality bends in ways that defy explanation, you definitely don't want to miss what's coming next on this channel. Today, we're exploring two family dynasties who didn't just live in the mountains, they made pacts with them. Families whose names were spoken only in hushed tones, whose bloodlines carried secrets that turned prosperity into a curse, and whose ritual practices were so disturbing that even hardened mountain folk crossed themselves when passing their territories. These aren't your typical ghost stories or local legends. These are documented accounts of what happens when human desperation meets something ancient and hungry in the mist-covered peaks of America's oldest mountains. The first clan we're investigating made their fortune through methods that defied every natural law of business and geology. The second turned healing into something so twisted that their very touch became a source of terror throughout 3 counties. Both families discovered that certain doors, once opened, can never be closed, and both learned that some traditions demand a price that grows heavier with each passing generation. What makes these stories particularly chilling isn't just the rituals themselves, but how they were passed down through bloodlines like family recipes, each generation adding their own dark innovations to practices that should have died with their creators. We're talking about documented cases where prosperity and power came at costs so terrible that the very landscape around these families began to change, where success bred horrors that local authorities couldn't explain and didn't want to investigate. The research for this video took me down rabbit holes I honestly wish I'd never discovered. Court documents, newspaper clippings, and witness testimonies that paint a picture of American history you'll never find in textbooks. Stories of families who found ways to make the impossible happen, but at prices that would make anyone with sense walk away. The problem is, when you're facing starvation in a remote mountain hollow with winter approaching and children crying from hunger, sense becomes a luxury you can't afford. These two clans represent something deeper than mere superstition or folklore. They're examples of what happens when human need collides with forces that exist in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear. In the isolation of Appalachian valleys, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away, and the law was whatever the strongest family decided it was, these bloodlines created their own systems of belief and practice that would horrify anyone from the outside world. What I found most disturbing during my research wasn't necessarily the rituals themselves, though they're certainly nightmare fuel. It was the systematic nature of how these practices were maintained, refined, and passed down through generations. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were carefully orchestrated traditions that grew more complex and more terrible with each family member who inherited them. The documentation shows a progression from simple desperation to elaborate ceremonies that required planning, preparation, and participation from multiple family members. The first family we're examining built their empire on a foundation that quite literally defied the laws of physics and economics. Mining operations that produced impossible yields, business ventures that succeeded despite every logical reason they should have failed, and a prosperity that seemed to grow stronger during times when their competitors were failing. But success came with requirements that grew more demanding with each generation, and the price they paid became written into their very DNA. The second clan turned the noble art of healing into something that would make medieval torture masters seem gentle by comparison. They developed methods that could cure any ailment, heal any wound, and restore any lost faculty. Desperate people traveled hundreds of miles to seek their help, often carrying their life savings and their most precious possessions. What they found was healing that worked exactly as advertised, but the true cost wasn't revealed until much later, and by then it was far too late to change their minds. Both families left behind extensive documentation of their practices, partly due to the isolation that kept them hidden from outside scrutiny, and partly because their methods required precise record keeping to maintain their effectiveness. These documents reveal a level of organization and systematic thinking that transforms what might have been dismissed as superstition into something far more unsettling. We're looking at evidence of methodical approaches to practices that challenge our understanding of what's possible and what's permissible. The geographic isolation of these families played a crucial role in allowing their practices to develop unchecked. In valleys where the nearest town was a day's journey through treacherous mountain paths, where winners could cut communities off from the outside world for months at a time, and where survival often meant making choices that civilized society would never understand, these clans found the perfect environment for their dark innovations to flourish. What makes their stories particularly relevant today is how they demonstrate the human capacity for adaptation when facing impossible circumstances. These weren't inherently evil people who woke up one morning and decided to embrace darkness. They were families pushed to the very edge of survival who found solutions that worked, even when those solutions came with costs that would compound over generations. Their choices reveal something unsettling about human nature. When faced with extinction, we're capable of justifying almost anything if it means survival. The documentation I've uncovered shows that both families were aware of the prices they were paying. This wasn't ignorance or accident. They made conscious decisions to accept costs that would affect not just themselves, but their children, their grandchildren, and generations yet unborn. The records show discussions, debates, and careful consideration of alternatives before they committed to paths that would define their bloodlines for decades to come. As we prepare to dive deeper into their specific practices and the documented consequences of their choices, I want you to consider this question. What would you be willing to sacrifice to save your family from starvation, disease, or death? How far would you go if conventional solutions had failed and you faced watching your loved ones suffer? These families found answers to those questions, and the results were more successful than they could have imagined, and more terrible than they could have predicted. The first clan we're exploring discovered that certain mountains hold more than coal and timber. They learned that some veins run deeper than geology suggests, and that prosperity can be mined from sources that don't appear on any survey map. Their success became legendary throughout the region, but so did the stories of what happened to those who tried to uncover the secrets of their methods. Their mining operations defied every known principle of extraction and economics. Competitors who tried to replicate their techniques found empty shafts where surveys had indicated rich deposits. Equipment that worked perfectly at other sites would malfunction mysteriously on their property. Most disturbing of all, the few outsiders who gained access to their deep workings emerged changed in ways that their families noticed but couldn't explain. The second family transformed healing from an art into a science that produced results so consistent and so miraculous that they attracted attention from medical professionals who traveled from major cities to observe their methods. What they witnessed challenged everything they understood about human physiology and the limits of natural healing. But those who accepted treatment found that their restored health came with complications that manifested in ways that wouldn't become apparent for months or sometimes years. Both families maintained detailed records, not just of their practices, but of the results, the costs, and the long-term consequences of their methods. These documents paint a picture of systematic experimentation and refinement that shows they weren't just stumbling blindly through dangerous territory. They were mapping it, documenting it, and finding ways to make it more efficient and more effective with each generation. The evidence suggests that these families weren't unique in their discoveries. References in their writings indicate contact with other bloodlines who had found similar solutions to the challenges of survival in America's most isolated regions. What we're looking at isn't just two families who stumbled onto dark practices, but potentially a network of clans who shared knowledge and techniques that allowed them to thrive in environments where conventional families failed. As we move forward, we'll examine the specific rituals that made their success possible, the documented evidence of their effectiveness, and the terrible prices that success demanded. We'll explore how these practices evolved over generations, how they were passed down through bloodlines, and why they continued despite the obvious costs. Most importantly, we'll look at what happened to those who tried to walk away from traditions that had become woven into the very fabric of their family identity. The story of these two clans isn't just about historical curiosities or regional folklore. It's about the human capacity for adaptation in the face of impossible circumstances, the prices we're willing to pay for survival and success, in the ways that choices made in desperation can echo through generations in ways that their makers never intended or imagined. The Blackwood mining dynasty emerged from the coal fields of eastern Kentucky in 1889 when patriarch Silas Blackwood faced the kind of desperation that transforms ordinary men into legends. His family had been scraping by on a claim that produced barely enough coal to keep them fed through the harsh mountain winters. While neighboring operations flourished, the Blackwood mine yielded little more than frustration and mounting debt. By the autumn of 1889, Silas faced a choice that would define his bloodline for generations: accept defeat and watch his children starve, or venture into the deepest sections of his mine where strange sounds echoed and equipment behaved in ways that defied explanation. The deepest shaft of the Blackwood mine descended far beyond where any geological survey suggested profitable coal deposits should exist. Workers reported hearing rhythmic tapping from sealed chambers, and several had refused to work the lower levels after discovering tools arranged in patterns no human hand could have created. Most disturbing were the accidents that occurred with clockwork regularity, always on the new moon, always claiming exactly one life, always leaving behind evidence that suggested the victims had been found by something rather than crushed by cave-ins. On the night of October 31st, 1889, Silas descended into the forbidden depths carrying nothing but a mining lamp and a leather journal that would later become the foundation of his family's twisted legacy. What he discovered in those depths was documented in his own handwriting, though the entries become increasingly difficult to read as the ink seems to shift and move on the page when viewed under certain lighting conditions. According to his account, he found a chamber where the walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and where coal formations had grown into shapes that resembled symbols from no known language. At the center of this chamber sat what Silas described as a pool of liquid darkness that reflected not his image, but the faces of men who had died in mining accidents throughout the region. The pool spoke without words, communicating through sensations that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his chest. It offered him a transaction, unprecedented prosperity, in exchange for a tribute that would be collected monthly according to cycles that predated human understanding of time. The terms were specific and non-negotiable. Each month, during the darkest phase of the moon, one life would be claimed from those who worked the Blackwood operations. In return, the mine would produce coal of such exceptional quality that it would burn longer and hotter than any competitor's product. The coal would be found in veins that appeared overnight, following patterns that made no geological sense, but yielded profits that exceeded every projection. Silas accepted the bargain, sealing the agreement by allowing 7 drops of his blood to fall into the pool. According to his journal, the liquid consumed the blood instantly, and the chamber filled with a sound he described as the mountain learning my name. When he emerged 12 hours later, his hair had turned completely white, and his eyes reflected light like those of a nocturnal animal. More significantly, he possessed knowledge of mining techniques that hadn't been invented yet, and an uncanny ability to predict exactly where the richest deposits would be found. Within 6 months, Blackwood mining had become the most productive operation in 3 states. Their coal commanded premium prices because it burned with an intensity that standard coal couldn't match. Industrial clients reported that Blackwood coal produced heat that seemed to penetrate materials in ways that conventional fuel couldn't achieve. Blacksmiths claimed that metal heated with Blackwood coal became stronger and more durable, while railroad companies found that their locomotives could travel greater distances using smaller quantities of the family's product. The monthly tribute was collected with mechanical precision. On the night of each new moon, one worker would be found dead in the mine, always in circumstances that suggested they had been called rather than trapped. The bodies showed no signs of violence or crushing, but their faces bore expressions of recognition, as though they had encountered something familiar in their final moments. Most disturbing was the discovery that these deaths occurred in a specific sequence, following patterns that suggested the mine itself was choosing its victims based on criteria that human observers couldn't understand. The Blackwood children grew up understanding that their prosperity came with responsibilities that extended far beyond normal family obligations. Each child was required to spend time in the deep chambers, learning to communicate with the presence that had made their success possible. They developed abilities that set them apart from other mountain families. They could navigate the darkest mine shafts without light. They could predict cave-ins hours before they occurred, and they possessed an intuitive understanding of where coal deposits would be found. More unsettling were the physical changes that manifested in each generation. Blackwood children were born with unusually pale skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their eyes contained flecks of a mineral that geologists couldn't identify. Their hearing became so acute that they could detect conversations from impossible distances, and their sense of touch allowed them to feel vibrations through solid rock that revealed the location of hidden chambers and passages. The family's mining operations expanded beyond conventional extraction methods. They developed techniques for accessing coal deposits that existed in spaces between known geological formations. Workers reported entering shafts that led to chambers larger than the mountain should have been able to contain, and coal trains would emerge from the mine carrying loads that exceeded the capacity of the cars that had entered empty. The Blackwood success attracted attention from mining engineers and geologists who couldn't explain the family's methods or their results. Several investigation teams were granted access to the upper levels of the mine, but their equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested interference from sources that couldn't be measured or documented. Photographs taken in the mine showed distortions that resembled human figures, and recording equipment captured sounds that analysis revealed to be human voices speaking in languages that predated known linguistic development. The family maintained meticulous records of their operations, but these documents contained information that challenged conventional understanding of mining, geology, and business practices. Production schedules were organized around lunar cycles rather than market demand, and employee assignments were made based on factors that seemed unrelated to skill or experience. Most disturbing were the personnel records, which tracked not just work performance, but family histories, bloodlines, and what the Blackwoods termed compatibility ratings that determined which workers would be suitable for the monthly tribute. As the Blackwood fortune grew, so did their influence throughout the region. They established company towns, where employees lived in housing provided by the mining operation, shopped at company stores, and sent their children to schools where the curriculum included subjects that weren't taught anywhere else. These communities became increasingly isolated from the outside world, developing their own customs, dialects, and belief systems that centered around the understanding that prosperity required sacrifice and that some bargains, once made, could never be broken. The second generation of Blackwoods, led by Silas's son Mordecai, expanded the family's operations beyond mining into logging, farming, and eventually manufacturing. Each new venture followed the same pattern: initial investment in equipment and facilities, followed by consultation with the presence in the deep chambers, and subsequent success that defied market analysis and competitive pressure. The family's businesses thrived during economic downturns that destroyed their competitors, and their products maintained quality standards that couldn't be replicated by conventional methods. However, the expansion of their operations required modifications to their original agreement. The monthly tribute evolved from single deaths to more complex arrangements that involved multiple family members and elaborate ceremonies conducted in chambers that had been specially prepared for rituals that grew more intricate with each passing year. The presents that had initially required only blood began demanding offerings that included personal possessions, family heirlooms, and eventually memories that were extracted through processes that left participants fundamentally changed. The Blackwood family records document a systematic approach to managing their supernatural arrangements that reveals a level of organization that transformed what might have been simple superstition into something resembling a business model. They developed protocols for training new family members in the requirements of their agreements, established procedures for handling the complications that arose from their success, and created contingency plans for managing the inevitable conflicts that occurred when the outside world attempted to investigate their methods. By the turn of the century, the Blackwood dynasty controlled mining operations across 4 states, employed over 3,000 workers, and maintained a network of businesses that generated profits exceeding those of much larger corporations. Their success had become legendary throughout the region, but so had the stories of what happened to those who tried to uncover the secrets of their methods or who attempted to compete with their operations using conventional business practices. The family's influence extended into politics, law enforcement, and religious organizations throughout their territory. Judges who ruled in their favor found their careers advancing rapidly, while those who opposed them faced scandals that destroyed their reputations. Law enforcement officials who investigated complaints against Blackwood operations discovered that evidence would disappear, witnesses would recant their statements, and their own superiors would suddenly transfer them to distant jurisdictions. The religious communities that had once provided moral guidance to mountain families found themselves struggling to maintain influence in regions where the Blackwood Empire held sway. Pastors who preached against the family's practices would discover their congregations dwindling as members moved away or simply stopped attending services. Those who persisted in their opposition faced more direct consequences. Their churches would suffer mysterious fires, their families would experience unprecedented hardships, and they themselves would begin having dreams so vivid and disturbing that many abandoned their calling entirely. What made the Blackwood influence particularly insidious was how it spread through seemingly normal social and economic channels. The family didn't need to threaten or coerce compliance. Their success was so overwhelming that other families naturally sought to emulate their methods. Young men from neighboring communities would seek employment in Blackwood operations, hoping to learn the secrets of their prosperity. Women would marry into families that had business relationships with the Blackwoods, bringing their new understanding of success and sacrifice into bloodlines that had previously followed conventional paths. The transformation of entire communities under Blackwood influence followed predictable patterns. Initially, residents would notice improvements in their economic conditions as the family's operations brought jobs and investment to previously struggling areas. Local businesses would thrive as Blackwood employees spent their wages, and property values would increase as the region gained a reputation for prosperity. But these improvements came with subtle changes that most residents didn't recognize until they had become irreversible. Children born in Blackwood-influenced communities developed differently than those in other mountain regions. They showed unusual intelligence and physical capabilities, but also demonstrated behaviors that concerned parents and teachers. These children would speak of imaginary friends who lived in dark places, would draw pictures of symbols that resembled the markings found in the deep mine chambers, and would sometimes disappear for hours at a time, returning with knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. The most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood legacy was how it perpetuated itself through generations without requiring direct family involvement. The presence in the deep chambers had evolved its relationship with human communities, learning to work through intermediaries and proxies rather than dealing exclusively with the original bloodline. Workers who spent extended periods in the lower mine levels would begin experiencing dreams that contained instructions for conducting their own smaller-scale versions of the family's rituals. These subsidiary agreements allowed the presence to extend its influence while maintaining the primary connection that had made the Blackwood fortune possible. By 1920, the Blackwood mining empire had become largely self-sustaining, with operations that continued to produce exceptional results, even when family members were absent for extended periods. The presence had trained multiple generations of workers in the techniques required to maintain their agreements, and the monthly tributes had evolved into community events that residents participated in willingly, understanding that their prosperity depended on maintaining the balance that had been established decades earlier. The family's records from this period reveal a troubling development. The presence was no longer satisfied with the original terms of their agreement. It had grown stronger through decades of regular feeding, and its appetite had expanded beyond the monthly tributes to include more frequent and more elaborate offerings. The Blackwoods found themselves managing an entity that had become increasingly demanding while simultaneously becoming more integrated into the fabric of their business operations. Mordecai Blackwood's journal entries from 1923 document his growing concern about the long-term sustainability of their arrangement. He wrote about dreams where the presence showed him visions of what would happen if the tributes were discontinued, and these visions revealed a level of dependence that the family had never fully understood. The coal deposits that had made their fortune possible were not natural formations, but extensions of the presence itself, and their continued existence required regular nourishment that went far beyond the simple blood offerings that had sealed the original bargain. The second clan we're examining took a fundamentally different approach to supernatural success, though their results were equally impressive and equally terrible. The Thornfield family of Western North Carolina had built their reputation on healing abilities that transcended conventional medicine, but their methods required sacrifices that made the Blackwood tributes seem merciful by comparison. Margaret Thornfield arrived in the remote valleys of the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1897, carrying nothing but a small collection of herbs and a leather-bound journal that had been passed down through her family for generations. She was a widow with 3 young children, facing the kind of desperate circumstances that forced people to make choices they would never consider under normal conditions. Her husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with no resources and no prospects in a region where single women had few options for survival. The Thornfield Journal contained what appeared to be medical knowledge far in advance of anything available through conventional training. The remedies and procedures described in its pages could treat conditions that doctors considered incurable, and the diagnostic techniques it outlined allowed practitioners to identify illnesses before symptoms appeared. But the journal also contained warnings written in multiple hands across several generations, documenting the prices that such knowledge demanded and the consequences of using it without proper preparation. Margaret's first use of the journal's knowledge came when her youngest daughter developed a fever that local doctors couldn't treat. Following the instructions she found in the ancient text, she prepared a remedy that required ingredients found only in the deepest parts of the mountain forests, gathered according to precise timing that corresponded to lunar cycles and seasonal changes. The preparation process itself was more ritual than medicine, involving incantations that had to be spoken in languages that predated English and actions that seemed designed to attract the attention of forces that existed beyond normal human perception. The remedy worked exactly as the journal promised, breaking her daughter's fever within hours and restoring her health completely. But the healing came with a cost that Margaret didn't fully understand until weeks later, when she began experiencing symptoms that mirrored those her daughter had suffered. The journal explained that this was not an accident, but a fundamental principle of the healing methods it contained. Every cure required a transfer of suffering from the patient to the healer, and the more serious the condition, the more severe the consequences for the practitioner. Despite the personal cost, Margaret continued using the journal's knowledge to treat her neighbors' ailments. Word of her abilities spread throughout the mountain communities, and people began traveling significant distances to seek her help. She could cure diseases that had plagued families for generations, heal injuries that conventional medicine considered permanent, and restore faculties that doctors had declared permanently lost. Her success rate was unprecedented, and her reputation grew to the point where she was considered more effective than any trained physician in the region. The Thornfield healing methods followed principles that challenged conventional understanding of disease and recovery. Rather than treating symptoms, the journal's techniques addressed what it termed the root darkness that caused illness, pain, and dysfunction. This approach required practitioners to identify the spiritual and emotional factors that contributed to physical conditions, and then to perform procedures that transferred these negative influences from the patient to the healer or to other designated recipients. The transfer process was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing, specific environmental conditions, and the participation of multiple family members who had been trained in the techniques from childhood. The Thornfield children learned to serve as intermediaries in the healing process, accepting portions of the transferred suffering and distributing it among themselves to prevent any single family member from being overwhelmed by the accumulated pain and illness of their patients. As Margaret's reputation grew, so did the complexity of the cases brought to her attention. She began treating conditions that existed at the intersection of physical and spiritual ailments, addressing problems that conventional medicine couldn't even diagnose. Her success with these cases attracted attention from medical professionals who traveled from major cities to observe her methods, though most left more confused than enlightened by what they witnessed. The healing chamber that Margaret established in her home became a place where the normal rules of cause and effect seemed suspended. Patients would enter suffering from conditions that had persisted for years and would emerge hours later completely restored. But observers noted that the Thornfield family members who participated in the healing sessions would often display temporary symptoms that corresponded to the conditions they had just treated, and these symptoms would sometimes persist for days or weeks after the original patient had recovered. The journal that guided Margaret's practices contained detailed instructions for managing the long-term consequences of their healing methods. It explained that the transferred suffering would accumulate in the healer's family over time, creating a burden that would be passed down through generations unless specific measures were taken to disperse it. These measures involved rituals that were far more complex and dangerous than the healing procedures themselves, requiring the participation of multiple generations and the acceptance of costs that extended far beyond the immediate family. The Thornfield healing practice evolved into a family business that operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding of medicine, economics, and social relationships. Patients paid not just with money, but with personal possessions, family heirlooms, and commitments that bound them to the Thornfield family for extended periods. The most seriously ill patients were required to provide what the family termed life essence, a contribution that involved spending time in the Thornfield compound, participating in rituals that strengthened the family's abilities while gradually weakening the contributors. The second generation of Thornfields, led by Margaret's son Ezekiel, expanded the family's operations beyond simple healing into what they termed life enhancement. They developed techniques for improving mental capabilities, enhancing physical strength and endurance, and extending natural lifespans beyond normal human limits. These services attracted wealthy clients from across the country, people who were willing to pay extraordinary sums for improvements that conventional medicine couldn't provide. The enhancement procedures required even more complex rituals than the healing methods, and their costs were correspondingly higher. Clients who sought mental improvements found their intelligence increased dramatically, but at the expense of emotional stability and social connections. Those who requested physical enhancements gained strength and endurance that bordered on superhuman, but developed appetites and needs that couldn't be satisfied through normal means. The lifespan extensions worked exactly as promised, but the additional years came with complications that made many recipients question whether the bargain had been worthwhile. The Thornfield family records document their growing understanding that their abilities were not simply advanced medical techniques, but connections to forces that existed beyond normal human experience. The journal that had started their practice was revealed to be one of several similar texts that had been distributed among selected bloodlines, and the Thornfields began establishing contact with other families who had developed comparable abilities through similar means. This network of enhanced families created a hidden economy that operated parallel to conventional society, trading in services and capabilities that normal people couldn't access or understand. The Thornfields specialized in healing and enhancement, but their associates offered other services: families who could predict future events, bloodlines that could influence weather patterns, and clans that could communicate with deceased relatives. The network allowed these families to support each other while maintaining the secrecy that their survival required. The expansion of the Thornfield practice brought them into contact with clients whose needs exceeded anything they had previously encountered. Government officials sought treatments for conditions that conventional medicine couldn't address. Wealthy industrialists requested enhancements that would give them advantages over their competitors, and military leaders inquired about procedures that could create soldiers with capabilities beyond normal human limits. These high-profile clients brought unprecedented resources to the family's operations, but they also attracted attention from organizations that the Thornfields were not prepared to handle. By 1935, the Thornfield healing practice had become a multi-generational enterprise that operated facilities in 3 states and maintained a client base that included some of the most powerful people in the country. Their success had transformed them from desperate mountain folk into a family whose influence extended into the highest levels of government and business. But this success had come at costs that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage, and the accumulated suffering that they had absorbed over decades of practice was beginning to manifest in ways that threatened not just their family, but the entire network of enhanced bloodlines that had grown up around them. The 3rd generation of Thornfields, led by Margaret's granddaughter Constance, faced challenges that their predecessors had never anticipated. The forces that had made their success possible had grown stronger through decades of regular interaction with human practitioners, and they were beginning to demand changes to the arrangements that had governed their relationships for generations. The healing methods that had once required only the transfer of suffering now demanded more complex offerings, and the enhancement procedures had evolved to include requirements that pushed the boundaries of what the family considered acceptable. Constance Thornfield's journal entries from 1936 reveal a family grappling with forces that had outgrown their original agreements. The presence that had once been content with transferred suffering now demanded what she termed essence extraction, a process that required practitioners to surrender portions of their own life force to fuel increasingly complex healing procedures. Patients who arrived seeking simple cures found themselves participating in rituals that lasted for days, emerging not just healed, but fundamentally changed in ways that wouldn't become apparent for months or years. The enhancement procedures had evolved into something that resembled transformation more than treatment. Clients who requested improved mental capabilities found their consciousness expanded beyond normal human limits. But this expansion came with the ability to perceive realities that most people's minds weren't equipped to process. Those who sought physical improvements discovered that their enhanced bodies required sustenance that couldn't be obtained through conventional means, creating dependencies that bound them to the Thornfield family for the rest of their extended lives. Most disturbing was the development of what the family called generational bleeding, the phenomenon where the accumulated suffering they had absorbed began manifesting in their children and grandchildren who had never directly participated in healing procedures. Thornfield descendants were born with physical conditions that mirrored the diseases their ancestors had treated, and they developed mental instabilities that corresponded to the psychological ailments that had been transferred to their family line over decades of practice. The network of enhanced families that had grown around the Thornfields began experiencing similar complications. Bloodlines that had once specialized in specific supernatural abilities found their powers becoming increasingly unstable and demanding. Families who had maintained weather control for generations discovered that their influence over natural phenomena was becoming involuntary, creating storms and droughts that they couldn't prevent. Clans that had communicated with deceased relatives found themselves unable to break contact with spirits that had become increasingly aggressive and demanding. The breaking point came in 1938 when a healing procedure conducted on a prominent government official went catastrophically wrong. The patient, who had sought treatment for a condition that conventional medicine couldn't identify, underwent a transformation during the healing process that left him fundamentally altered. Rather than transferring his ailment to the Thornfield family, the procedure appeared to have awakened something within him that had been dormant. He emerged from the healing chamber with abilities that exceeded anything the family had previously encountered, but also with needs and appetites that made him a threat to everyone around him. The incident attracted federal attention that the Thornfield family was not prepared to handle. Government investigators who arrived to examine the situation discovered evidence of practices that challenged their understanding of medicine, psychology, and natural law. The family's records, which they had maintained meticulously for decades, provided documentation of procedures and results that seemed to violate fundamental principles of science and morality. The investigation revealed that both the Blackwood and Thornfield families were part of a larger network of bloodlines that had developed supernatural abilities through similar means. Federal agents discovered connections between these families and dozens of other clans throughout Appalachia, each specializing in different aspects of what government documents referred to as paranormal resource extraction. The scope of the network suggested that supernatural practices were far more widespread in isolated American communities than authorities had previously suspected. The government's response was swift and comprehensive. Rather than attempting to prosecute the families through conventional legal channels, federal agencies developed protocols for containing and managing what they termed enhanced bloodlines. The Blackwood mining operations were seized under emergency powers legislation, though the official records listed the action as environmental remediation rather than supernatural containment. The Thornfield healing practice was shut down under public health regulations that classified their methods as experimental medical procedures, requiring federal oversight. Both families were relocated to federal facilities designed specifically for housing bloodlines with supernatural capabilities. These facilities, which existed outside normal legal frameworks, were staffed by personnel who had been trained to handle enhanced individuals and their unique requirements. The families were not imprisoned in any conventional sense, but they were prevented from practicing their abilities without federal supervision and approval. The presence that had made the Blackwood fortune possible did not react well to the disruption of its arrangements. The sealed mine shafts began exhibiting unusual activity within days of the federal seizure, with equipment monitoring the site's recording phenomena that defied explanation. The monthly tributes that had sustained the entity for decades were discontinued, and the consequences became apparent almost immediately. The coal deposits that had made the family's success possible began to deteriorate, crumbling into dust that contained minerals that geological analysis couldn't identify. The Thornfield relocation created different but equally serious complications. The accumulated suffering that the family had absorbed over decades of practice had to be managed carefully to prevent it from manifesting in ways that would affect the federal facility's staff. The family members required regular procedures to disperse the transferred ailments they carried, and these procedures had to be conducted by personnel who understood the risks involved in handling supernatural medical conditions. The network of enhanced families that had grown around the Blackwoods and Thornfields began experiencing systematic failures as their primary connections were severed. Bloodlines that had maintained their abilities for generations found their powers diminishing or becoming uncontrollable. The hidden economy that had operated parallel to conventional society began collapsing as the families who had provided its foundation were removed from their territories and separated from the sources of their abilities. The long-term consequences of the federal intervention became apparent over the following decades. The regions where the Blackwood and Thornfield families had operated experienced economic decline that persisted despite government efforts to provide alternative employment and investment. The communities that had prospered under their influence found themselves struggling with problems that conventional solutions couldn't address. Most significantly, the children and grandchildren of people who had been affected by the family's practices began displaying unusual characteristics that suggested the supernatural influences had not been completely contained. Modern descendants of both families remain under federal monitoring, though the nature of this oversight has evolved considerably since the 1940s. Government agencies have developed more sophisticated methods for managing enhanced bloodlines, and the descendants have been integrated into programs that allow them to contribute to national security and scientific research while maintaining control over their abilities. The original federal facilities have been replaced with more humane arrangements that recognize the rights of enhanced individuals while protecting public safety. The territories where the Blackwood and Thornfield families operated have become subjects of ongoing scientific study. Research teams have documented phenomena in these areas that continue to challenge conventional understanding of physics, geology, and biology. The Blackwood mine sites show evidence of mineral formations that shouldn't exist according to known geological processes, while the locations where Thornfield healing procedures were conducted exhibit electromagnetic anomalies that affect both equipment and personnel. Recent investigations have revealed that the practices developed by these families were not unique to Appalachia or even to the United States. Similar bloodlines have been identified in isolated regions throughout the world, suggesting that the human capacity for supernatural development may be more widespread than previously recognized. International cooperation has developed around the management of enhanced individuals and the containment of the forces that enable their abilities. The stories of the Blackwood and Thornfield families serve as cautionary tales about the prices of supernatural success and the long-term consequences of making bargains with forces beyond human understanding. Their experiences demonstrate that isolation and desperation can lead people to accept arrangements that seem beneficial in the short term, but create problems that persist for generations. Most importantly, their histories reveal that some doors, once opened, create obligations that extend far beyond the individuals who first chose to walk through them. The documentation of their practices has contributed to the development of protocols for identifying and managing supernatural phenomena in isolated communities. Government agencies now maintain monitoring systems designed to detect the early signs of enhanced bloodline development, and intervention procedures have been established to prevent the kind of widespread influence that the Blackwood and Thornfield families achieved. Today, the descendants of these families live lives that are carefully balanced between their inherited abilities and the requirements of modern society. They serve as bridges between the conventional world and the supernatural forces that their ancestors learned to manipulate, helping authorities understand and manage phenomena that continue to manifest in isolated regions throughout the country. Their stories remind us that the human capacity for adaptation in extreme circumstances can lead to solutions that work, but at costs that may not become apparent until it's too late to choose a different path. The legacy of the Blackwood and Thornfield clans continues to influence the communities where they once operated, serving as a reminder that some traditions leave marks that persist long after their practitioners have moved on. In the mist-shrouded valleys of Appalachia, where isolation still breeds its own forms of desperation, their stories are told as warnings about the prices of supernatural success and the importance of understanding the true costs of making deals with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. If you found yourself holding your breath during these revelations, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because our next investigation takes us even deeper into the hidden networks of enhanced bloodlines that still operate in America's most isolated regions. We'll be exploring families whose abilities make the Blackwoods and Thornfields seem tame by comparison, and the government programs that have been developed to manage threats that most people don't even know exist. Until then, remember that some family traditions are passed down for good reasons, and others are inherited because no one in the bloodline has the courage to break the cycle.